All right, now we're now struggling with the problem of truth. What is truth? I'm going to answer that question today. But we saw Tarski had an answer to it, and I started to make certain objections. But let me go back and show what he thought was one of its great virtues. One of the puzzles that he has to deal with is the liar paradox. This sentence is false, or this statement is false. If it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's true. And he thinks his semantic conception of truth solves the liar paradox by showing that it's ill-formed. Since truth is a semantic predicate, it is a predicate in the meta-language about the object language. And everybody remembers the difference between the meta-language and the object language. The object language is the language you're talking about, and the meta-language is the language you're using to talk about the object language. So if I say, la plume is a French noun phrase, I'm using French as the object language, and I'm using English as the meta-language to talk about French. So when we say a sentence or a statement is true, we're using a meta-linguistic predicate to talk about an object language sentence or statement. Now, since it is a meta-linguistic predicate, it can't be applied to itself. You'd be treating the object language and the meta-language as the same, and that's bad logic. You're not allowed to do that. So we solve the liar paradox by showing that sentences like this sentence is false, or this sentence is true, are ill-formed, since truth and falsity are meta-linguistic predicates. Now, often we will use English as both the object language and the meta-language. That's all right. We use English to talk about English. That's okay. As long as you make clear when you're using English as a meta-language and when you're using as an object language. But what you cannot do is say this statement is false, because then you would be using false and true as if they were both object language and meta-linguistic predicates, and you can't do that. And in a way, that conforms to common sense, because we do want to say, look, the problem with this statement is false. If somebody came to me and said this statement is false, you'd immediately want to know which statement, and you haven't made a statement. If you say, yeah, well, this statement is false. Yeah, well, what statement? I didn't hear one. Well, that statement that this statement is false. But there was no content to which you can apply the word true. And that's actually a deep point that I'll come back to later when I give a positive analysis of the concept of truth. Okay, but by the way, you pay too big a price if you want to say self-reference is ill-formed. That is, there's something logically absurd about saying this statement is false, because you're using both the false as both a object language and meta-linguistic predicate. Because often you do want self-reference. You do want to be able to use expressions that refer to themselves, and that seems to me perfectly legitimate. If somebody says to you, say something in French, and I say, cette phrase est en français, I have said something about a French sentence in French. I've said in French that it's French. Or if I say, I am now speaking in English, that's, again, self-referential. These sentences that I'm now uttering are English sentences. That's self-referential. There's nothing wrong with it. So self-reference as such does not seem to me objectionable. What's wrong with the self-reference in the liar paradox? It's hard for me to take the liar paradox as a big deal. Because it seems to me it has a common sense answer. The common sense answer is, whenever you say that something is true or false, there has to be some content other than simple truth and falsity, which is said to be true or false. So if I say the statement that snow is white is true, and the statement that snow is black is false, then there is some content other than truth and falsity themselves that are said to be true or false. The statement that snow is white, that's got a content, and that's said to be true, and the statement that snow is black, that's another content, and that's said to be false. But if the only content is this statement itself, then there is no content. This statement is true. Well, what statement? There isn't any. I have no content to which true can be applied. And if this statement is false was paradoxical, then this statement is true should be paradoxical. But the problem is both of them are empty, not self-contradictory. They're empty because so far nothing has been said to be true or false. Okay, I'll come back to that point when I give you a positive account of truth, what the word true actually does. All right, now I said there are a bunch of objections to Tarski, and let me give them. The most serious objection, I think, is one that was originally made by Hartree Field, who said, look, he doesn't tell you what it is that all true statements have in common in virtue of which they are true. He just says, well, snow is white is true if and only if snow is white, and coal is black is true if and only if coal is black, and so on through the other cases. And he gives you an account that satisfies this quotation, but it does not identify the property that all true statements have in common in virtue of which they are true. And I think that's a serious objection. And we'll see the depth of that if we consider some other related difficulties. Tarski does, and this is a second objection, Tarski does not define truth, but only truth relative to a language, truth relative to English, or truth relative to French, or as he preferred, to a formalized language. Remember, he had a contempt for ordinary language. He wanted only well-defined, formalized languages. But the problem is that's not what we're interested in the philosophical problem of truth. It isn't that we're interested in truth for English. We want to know what property it is that true statements have in common in virtue of which they're true, and that would carry across English, French, or German, or whatever. So Tarski does not, it's important to emphasize this, Tarski doesn't define truth. He defines truth relative to a language. I think, by the way, he would agree with that and say, yeah, okay, I don't care about the old-fashioned philosophical problem. I'm trying to revive a certain version of the correspondence theory for a formalized language. And the fact that it doesn't satisfy all the messy, ordinary language conceptions, well, who cares? But one difficulty, and this is a third objection to Tarski, is that it won't work if you introduce a new expression in the language. Remember, I gave you this Mickey Mouse language that has is bald, is fat, is drunk, or whatever. But if you introduce a new word, truth isn't defined for that. You have to go back and redefine it for every new word. It's only defined for a fixed language, and that's not how we normally think of truth. Truth is a property, and that property can apply if new words are introduced into the language. Another objection, and this is the fourth objection that I want to make to Tarski, is in general we don't accept this kind of account for defining concepts. If somebody wants to say, well, what's the definition of a city? And I say, oh, well, a city is, something is a city if and only if, and then I give a list of all of the cities in the world, beginning with Albany, and I don't know what city named with Z, but anyway, going from A to Z, I just list all the cities in the world. Well, that doesn't tell you what a city is. It just gives us a list, and that's really what Tarski does. That's the gimmick that he uses to enable him to give a non-circular definition of truth. It's called recursion, and the recursion just gives us with a list, and generally we would not accept that as an analysis of a concept. Now, I think he might say, well, truth is a formal concept. Think of existence. What is it that all existing things have in common in virtue of which they exist? But the difficulty is I can explain the meaning of existence. I can explain that predicate. I mean, to say X exists is to say that a certain concept is instantiated, or that there are instances of the concept. And I don't see that we've got that in the case of Tarski's definition of truth. And so I'm going to give you in a few minutes a version of the correspondence theory that I think that avoids these objections. There's a deeper objection to the Tarski approach that I'm not sure I can state precisely, but it's something like this. In philosophy, you cannot answer the philosophical question by using these sorts of tricks where you substitute something else like recursion. Now that's why philosophy differs from logic and mathematics. I mean, Gödel's theorem does rest on a kind of a trick. And the philosophical point is that it works, and that is a deep philosophical point. But in the philosophical answer to the question, you don't answer the question. You evade the question. You answer a different question if you use a logical device like recursion to avoid having to face the question. And my dissatisfaction with mainstream philosophy of language has a lot to do with the fact that a technical apparatus is often substituted for a philosophical analysis. To put it in words of one syllable, I think the fancy set theoretical apparatus that Tarski uses, and I haven't tried to explain it to you, but you can look up the original article, the concept of truth in formalized languages, and I don't know anybody who would try to teach it in an undergraduate course. I mean, I usually get stuck about definition 22. It goes on, and it's extremely technically brilliant. But as far as I can tell, it makes no contribution whatever to what I think of as the philosophical problem of truth. You can get a mapping of the philosophical problem onto the technical apparatus, but I don't see that you get any insight into the philosophical problem by the formal apparatus. Okay, I know that sounds anti-intellectual, and I don't intend it that way. I had great admiration for Tarski. I thought he was a very smart guy. He was a fanatic Polish nationalist, as only Polish refugees can be. I once had dinner at their house, and I don't know, I probably shouldn't tell you this story, but anyway, it's kind of fun. I was sitting next to Maria, his wife, and we were talking about Chopin. And I said, Chopin, great French composer. And Maria just hit me. She didn't even think about it. She just hauled off and belted me with her fist, not in the jaw, but she let me know, as only Poles can, that when you're talking about the greatest Polish composer of all, you don't try to dump him into Paris, for God's sake. But anyway, okay. But he was a great logician, and I think along with Frege, Gödel, and Aristotle, and maybe we got to throw Leibniz in there too, one of the greatest logicians who ever lived. All the same, I don't think that the theory of truth adds any. Well, I won't say it doesn't add any, but it doesn't give us a deep understanding of the concept of truth. Its interest is to show that you can do this gimmick with recursion, where you just list all of the terms in the language, and that is a technical, that's an ingenious technical device, but it does not add to our philosophical understanding of truth. Okay, with all that said, I'm going to give you a version of the correspondence theory and show how it's what we're trying to understand when we try to understand the philosophical problem of truth. However, before we leave Tarski, let's take questions about that, or objections, or any worries that people have. Everybody's up with us. Yes, Mike.
So the problem with the enumerative character
Yeah.
definition comes in because it defines truth, needs, and reference and satisfaction.
Yeah.
And those you just sort of list.
Yeah. That's my Mickey Mouse version. He doesn't use reference. He uses satisfaction and a set theory. So there's an elaborate set theoretical apparatus that he uses. But I try to give a simple version so you can see the nature of the devices being used. Go ahead.
So if we were willing to take satisfaction or reference as just a primitive notion, then we could define truth in terms of that.
That's right.
We wouldn't have this issue.
That's right. We would not. And Tarski obviously wouldn't accept that because he wants to define truth in non-semantic notions. He does not. Reference and satisfaction are both semantic notions. Now, I think you can't do it in non-semantic notions. In that sense, you can't define truth because it is a semantic notion. There isn't any non-semantic notion in terms of which you're going to define it. And that leads me to the next point I wanted to make, and that is, why do we have this word in the language at all? It's perfectly possible to have a language that doesn't have the word true, and I would suppose that for a long time languages probably didn't have a word for true. And the answer is we need it because we need to assess speech acts and intentional states that have the downhill or word-to-world direction of fit, or in the case of beliefs, mind-to-world direction of fit. And the favorite terms for assessing that are true or false. There are other terms such as exaggerated, irrelevant, boring, trivial. We have all sorts of words for assessing the success or failure, but the favorites are true or false because they tell you that there is or is not a match. And it's just like obeyed for orders or kept for promises. So an order is obeyed if and only if the person that you gave the order to does the thing that you ordered him to do. That's just like the correspondence theory of true. A proposition is true if and only if the world is the way that it says that it is. Or a promise is kept if and only if the person who makes the promise does the things that he or she promises to do. So that's a sort of a version of the correspondence theory for orders and promises, and we need words like obeyed for orders and words like kept for promises because we need to assess success or failure. What I'm trying to do now is domesticate the problem of truth. It's no more a big deal than the problem of obeyed in the case of orders or kept in the case of promises, and so on through other types of speech acts. And you can get the same kind of self-referential paradoxes for those cases. This statement is false. How about disobey this order? I order you to disobey this order. Well, that order is obeyed if and only if it's disobeyed, and it's disobeyed only if it's obeyed. But is that a big deal? I don't think so. It's just the problem with it is you haven't been given a content, which would be the content of the order. Or how about, I promise not to keep this promise. Same problem all over again. If I keep the promise, then I didn't keep it, and if I didn't keep it, then I did. But again, I think these are little paradoxes that we can generate out of language, but they don't show anything really deep or profound. Now, not everybody agrees with me. Van McGee, who teaches at MIT, has written a book where he says that the liar paradox is the leading problem today in the philosophy of language. Now, Van was a TA in this very course, so I know he's smart, and I know he understands the philosophical issues, but I don't think it's that big a deal. And I may be Philistine. Have a look at his book about the liar paradox. His name is Van McGee. And I see if you think the liar paradox raises deep questions. I don't think it does. I think that Russell's paradox does. The class of all classes that are not members of themselves, and I'm dissatisfied with the set theoretical solutions that are given to that. Okay. So now let us, with that in mind, that is, with the idea that Tarski, whatever the technical brilliance of his account is, does not give us a solution to the philosophical problem. What is the philosophical problem, and what is its solution? Well, we would like to be able to say what it is, what the property of truth is, which makes it the case of true propositions that they are true, and makes it a case of false propositions that they are false. And I think the short answer to that is, that I've just hinted at it, truth is a term that we need to assess success in achieving the downhill or word-to-world direction of fit. Every intentional state and every speech act that has this structure, or in the case of intentional states, this structure, and has a direction of fit either this way or this way, will have conditions of satisfaction. And the conditions of satisfaction will be what must be the case in the world if the speech act or the intentional state is satisfied. In the case of beliefs and assertions, there isn't any way to state the condition of satisfaction without repeating the content of the belief or the assertion. In a way, that's also true of orders and promises. When you state the condition of satisfaction of the order, you don't have to give the order, but you have to state the very content of the order. So if I order you to leave the room, then the order will be obeyed if and only if you leave the room. And that's just like saying the statement that you leave the room will be true if and only if you leave the room. In both cases, you're stating the conditions of satisfaction. Now, the insight that lies behind the correspondence theory is that in general, a statement is true if and only if there's something in the world in virtue of which it is true. I have to say in general because you have puzzling cases of self-reference. If I say, I am now speaking English, that's true not in virtue of something outside the utterance, but in virtue of a feature of the utterance. But I don't think that's a serious counterexample. In general, we can say statements are made true or true in virtue of something other than the statement, and it's in virtue of that thing that they are true. And we need to talk about what those things are. David Armstrong has introduced, I think he introduced this, he introduced the notion of a truth maker. And in general, we can say statements are true in virtue of the fact that there's something that makes them true, and that's the truth maker. Now, I think that's the insight that lies behind the correspondence theory. And the idea is, look, it's because here's the statement and here's the truth maker. Another word for the truth maker is a fact. Here's the statement and here's the fact. And it's in virtue of that that the statement is true. Okay, now I said there were some objections to the correspondence theory, and let me state those objections and answer them. The first objection is, well, what about negative statements, hypothetical statements, disjunctive statements, counterfactual statements? In virtue of what are they true? What's the fact that corresponds to the fact that there are no elephants in this room? And is it the same fact that corresponds to the statement that there are no giraffes in this room? See, you can see what fact corresponds to the statement, I have a piece of chalk in my right hand. That's pretty easy. But how about the statement, there are no elephants in this room? That is certainly a true statement. What's the fact? Now, I want to say there's a simple answer to that, and it reveals a deep philosophical urge that we find difficulty in accepting that answer. And the answer is, the word fact is just a word that we need to name satisfied truth conditions. The word fact just is a general term for truth makers. So a statement is true if and only if, and then what? There's something in virtue of which it's true, call that a fact. So just as I can say it's true that there are no elephants in this room, I can say it's just a plain fact that there are no elephants in this room. If somebody doubts that, we can check under all of the chairs and open all the drawers and so on in case some elephant has snuck under a chair or in a drawer. But in short, what I'm suggesting is there is no problem about negatives, hypotheticals, disjunctives, counterfactuals. Well, so the cat is on the mat. That statement corresponds to the fact that the cat is on the mat. But how about if the cat had not been on the mat, then the dog would have had to have been in the kitchen. What fact does that correspond to? Well, I just stated it, assuming it's true. It's the fact that if the cat had not been on the mat, then the dog would have not been in the kitchen. Now, why do we find that hard to accept? And I think the answer is we want facts to be like objects. See, the cat is on the mat. I mean, if this is the cat and this is the mat, that satisfies our urge to think it's a kind of complex thing, the fact. But of course, it's not a thing. It's just a condition. A fact is a satisfied truth condition. Now, I'll say more about that, but I think that is the first step in rescuing the correspondence theory from our urge to misunderstand it. The first objection is it can't deal with negatives, hypotheticals, counterfactuals, and all the rest of it? And the answer is it deals with them trivially. For every true statement, there is, guess what, one and only one fact to which it corresponds. And how do you discover that fact? You state that statement, because that's what the statement does. It states a fact. And the fact that the statement has to be used to state the fact is not an objection. It's a condition of adequacy, because, of course, precisely what we want is that there should be a perfect match between the statement and the fact, because the word fact exists in the language to state the satisfied truth conditions. That's why we have the word fact. Let's go over this a little more carefully, and then I'll take questions. I always look at etymology, and if you look at the etymology of the word true, in some etymological dictionaries, it says it goes back to the Indo-European root for tree, and it's clearly related to trust and trustworthy, and that suggests that there's a kind of uprightness to the truth, and it is trustworthy if it's true. And this again suggests what I was hinting at earlier, namely that you need a word for success or failure, and the word true has evolved to do that. Now, how about the word fact? Well, the word fact is fairly recent. As I mentioned, I don't think the Greeks had a word for fact, and that's why Aristotle wanted to state the correspondence theory, but couldn't state it by saying a true statement is one that corresponds to the facts. Remember, what he says is, to say of that which is that it is, and to say of that which is not that it is not, is to state the truth. And that sounds to me like the correspondence theory. It's just he can't use the word fact because he doesn't have it. It came in fairly late in English, and the standard dictionaries say that it is the past participle of the Latin verb facere, meaning to do or to make, and the basic idea of the fact is it's a done thing, and in French the fait accompli, and in German the Tatsache, the thing which is tat, which is done, and so that's what it has evolved. We need a word to name satisfied truth conditions, and the word fact has evolved to fit that need. Okay, so that's the first objection to the correspondence theory. Can't deal with negatives, hypotheticals, counterfactuals, and the answer is it deals with them trivially, because the word fact has precisely evolved so that you get a perfect match between the statement and the fact. Okay, second objection to the correspondence theory was it leads to skepticism, because there's no way you can ever get outside the circle of language to survey the relationships between language and reality to see if there really is a correspondence. And the answer to that objection is that the correspondence theory is not a theory about verification. How do you verify the statement? Not by jumping outside a language and looking at the statement and then looking at the fact to see if they match. Rather, tell me the statement and I'll tell you how to verify it. The way you verify the statement that there's water in this jar, or in this thermos, is by, for example, doing what I'm now doing. Yep, it's water. If it were gin, this would probably be a more interesting lecture, but harder to take notes than the one I'm actually giving you. So the idea, a misunderstanding of the correspondence theory is to say that, well, what it really tells us is how to verify a statement is to get outside the statement and get outside the facts and then see if there's a match. No, that's not it at all. What the correspondence theory tells us is the meaning of the word true. It's not an analysis in non-semantic terms, because, of course, it's circular, because words like fact and correspond are in the same family as true. But that's all right. What we want is an explanation of the meaning of the word true, how it functions in the language, and we need a word to describe the relationships, to describe what makes it the case that a statement is true when it is true, and the word fact has evolved to meet that need. So the answer is it doesn't lead to skepticism because it's not a theory about how you find out the truth. It's not a theory of verification. It's a theory about the meaning. Now, the third objection to the correspondence theory is, I think, the most subtle of the three. And for a long time, I used to believe it, and that is that the correspondence theory can't really succeed in saying anything. There can't be a relation of correspondence because there's no way to identify the terms of the correspondence independently of each other. If you ask the question, which fact does the statement correspond to, the only way that you can answer that question is by making the same statement. The statement that snow is white corresponds to the fact that snow is white because you don't have two independent things, the statement and the fact. Rather, to identify the fact is just to state a true statement. And this led Strawson to say facts are what statements, when true, state. They're not things or complexes of things. And you remember Austin was furious at that, and he called that a perverted little rigmarole. And they had this famous debate, which you can, it was printed in the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society, and it's kind of fun, and it's generally agreed that Strawson won. And I, for a long time, thought he won, but I think in a way Austin had a deeper point that he didn't succeed. Austin wasn't all that great in philosophical arguments. I think he was a great philosopher, but he wasn't as quick as some philosophers. But I think that this point can be answered as well. Of course, there's no way to identify the fact independently of a true statement. But that's not because true statements just are facts, and facts just are true statements. Which is what Frege thought. Frege thought a fact just was a true statement. There wasn't any difference. But rather, there's a perfect match because one is evolved to fit the other. You need something to name on the world side what corresponds on the language side, and the word that has evolved, the word fact, is such that if you specify the fact, since what you're specifying is a satisfied truth condition, you need to state the condition. And the statement of the condition that snow is white, we use the same terms and the same vocabulary as the fact that snow is white. That makes it look as if you don't have two independent entities, but you do, because the facts in the world are not the same as the representation of those facts in language. So I think this third objection, though I think it is the most powerful of the three, is not decisive. Well, is there any argument to show that facts are not the same as true statements or true propositions? Yes, I think there is, and I gave it to you briefly, and it's this, that in the case of the word fact, facts can function causally in a way that true statements cannot. If I say the fact that Napoleon perceived the danger to his left flank caused him to move Maréchal Ney's troop. A Ney is spelled like this, N-E-Y. Maréchal Ney's troops to that flank. I think that can be, assuming that's true, then we're talking about a certain fact, the fact that Napoleon perceived a danger, and that fact caused Napoleon to behave in a certain way. And you wouldn't succeed in saying that by saying that the true proposition, because true propositions are representations. They don't in that way cause things in the way that facts in the world can cause things. Okay, but now why do we feel there's something dissatisfying about saying, well, a statement that if the cat had not been on the mat, then the dog would have had to have been in the kitchen, that there is a fact that corresponds to that, namely the same fact. Why do we feel uncomfortable with that? And I think the answer is because we feel facts, because they're conditions in the world, ought to have a kind of concreteness. You ought to be able to point at the damn fact and hammer a nail into the constituents of the fact, and so on. And this was certainly the case in Wittgenstein's early work. In his in the Tractatus, where he tries to state a certain correspondence model of language. And their early work, Russell and Wittgenstein both thought of facts as actually concrete arrangements of things in the world. And that is an urge we feel, but I think it's one that we can remove by seeing, as later Wittgenstein would say, by seeing how the language game with the word fact is actually played. The way it's played is the word fact is used to specify the condition in the world that makes a statement true. That in virtue of which a true statement is true. Okay, but we still have a problem. I mean, assuming now that we see that Tarski doesn't really answer the question that worries us, and that initially at least the objections to the correspondence theory can be answered. All the same, we ought to be able to resolve the dispute between the minimalist theory that says all you need to know about truth is disquotation. S is true if and only if P, the statement that snow is white, is true if and only if snow is white, and for that reason truth adds nothing. Disquotation tells you all that you need to know. Now that's sometimes called the redundancy theory of truth. Truth is absolutely redundant. But some people have pointed out, well, it's not 100% redundant, because you still need to say things like, everything that the policeman said was true, or everything that the witness said is false. And you can't, it's hard to say that with disquotation. I think you probably could just say for all S, if the statement said S, then P, for all S and for all P, if S states P, then if the policeman said S, then P. I think you could probably do it, but it doesn't matter. What these guys are trying to get at is there's no separate property of truth. All you need to know about truth can be given by disquotation. All right, but on the other hand, there is a correspondence theory that says, no, there's something more to truth than just disquotation. Disquotation gets at the feature that we're really interested in, and that feature is correspondence. Now, what I'm going to do next is show you these look inconsistent, the minimalist theory and the correspondence theory, but given a couple of very natural assumptions, you can derive the correspondence theory from the minimalist theory. So that's what I'm going to do as part of the defense of a version of the correspondence theory. Okay, I'm going to stop for questions, but let me just summarize what I've been saying in this part. I've said there are three answers to the three objections to the correspondence theory, and they can all be answered. One is correspondence theory can't deal with negative facts and other sorts of facts. Answer is it deals with them trivially. The notion of a fact just is the notion of any condition that makes a statement true. The second objection is it leads to skepticism. It doesn't. It's only a certain picture generated by the correspondence theory that leads to skepticism. The picture is that you verify a statement by getting outside and surveying the relation of statements to reality, and you can't do that. And then it will look as if, well, then you could never verify a statement. But the answer is the correspondence theory is not a theory of verification. It's a semantic theory about the meaning of the word true. And the third objection is there can't be two separate things, the statement and the fact, because there's no way to identify the fact other than by stating a true statement. And the answer to that is it doesn't really follow from the fact that the way you identify a statement is by a way you identify a fact is by stating a true statement, because the word fact and true statement have evolved to precisely to match each other in this way. They're like order and obedience, or promise and kept promise. So statement and true statement have exactly the same set of relationships, and it doesn't follow from the fact that you have to repeat the proposition in order to state the right-hand side. In order to state the fact, it doesn't follow that you don't have two things, the fact and the truth condition. A statement and a truth condition. A fact just is a satisfied truth condition. All right, but now I'm going to show how to derive the correspondence theory from the minimalist theory. But let's stop for questions. I want to make sure everybody's up with me, because this is heavy-duty stuff, and I don't want to go too fast. Yeah?
About the first objective, I thought that what that was asking was, what is it about the state of the world that makes
That's right.
negative statements true and all that?
That's right.
Well, but so, I'm not sure how
Okay, let me go through this. Now, I think this is you put your finger on a very deep philosophical worry. If I say, what is it about the state of the world that makes it true that I have a piece of chalk in my right hand? Well, have a look. It's that state of the world. That's the fact in the world. But if somebody says, yes, okay, now what is it about the state of the world that makes it the case that there are no elephants in this room? I want to say, look around. That's what makes it the case. The fact that there are no elephants in this room is what corresponds to the true statement, there are no elephants in this room. And our urge in philosophy is always to think, yeah, but there ought to be a thing. You see, you ought to be able to point to the guy's hand and the piece of chalk. What are you going to, you haven't got anything you can point to. But now what I'm trying to do is remove that urge. I want you to see the word fact is a humble word. It is not some deep metaphysical construct invented by great thinkers like Leibniz. For all I know, he may have been one of the inventors. But the point is, it's a humble, ordinary word, and it just means a satisfied truth condition. So if you want to know what fact corresponds to the statement, there are no elephants in this room, the answer is the fact that there are no elephants in this room. Now, it's much tougher in the case of counterfactuals, because often we don't know how to decide. If a few voters in Florida had changed their minds, then George Bush would not have been elected president in the year 2000. Now, that's much harder to establish that fact, but clearly that's what if that is a fact, then what makes the statement true is that very fact. But that's trivial. There must be a trivial connection between true statement and fact, because they have evolved one to match the other. So the fact that corresponds to the true statement, there are no elephants in this room, is the fact that there are no elephants in this room. If there had been live tigers in this room, we would all have been scared and would have left by the nearest possible exit. Okay, that's counterfactual. And I venture to say that's true, but what fact makes it true? The only fact that could make it true is the one I just stated. If there had been life, well, I won't go through the whole thing. Again, I probably couldn't repeat it exactly the same the second time. But that's the idea. The idea is if you look at the ordinary use of these words, then that's what the word fact does. It marks a satisfied truth condition. So our equivalence here, truth maker equals fact equals satisfied truth condition. In the same way that obedience marks a satisfied obedience condition of an order. A satisfied truth condition just is a fact. However, your question raises some deep puzzles. Suppose you take two statements that are logically equivalent in the sense that if one is true, then the other one must be true. Do they correspond to the same fact? I don't think they do, but I want to try this out on you. Take the statement, all ravens are black. Now, logicians love to tell us that's equivalent to all non-black things are non-ravens. Does everybody get that? It's early enough in the morning that it's probably worth writing it, the whole thing on the blackboard. All ravens are black will be true if and only if all non-black things are non-ravens. So this is all ravens are black, and this is all if it's not black, all non-black things are non-ravens. Okay, because if it had been, a black thing, it would have been a raven, given that all ravens are black. Now, the first one is true if and only if the second one is true. All ravens are black if and only if all non-black things are non-ravens. Is the fact that corresponds to all ravens are black the same as the fact that all non-black things are non-ravens? I don't think so. I think those are different facts, though the one will obtain if and only if the other obtains. If I were going to draw a picture of the first fact, I would have a circle representing black things, and I'd put ravens inside the circle. But if I were going to draw a picture of the second one, I would have a picture. I would have a circle showing all non-ravens, and then I would put all non-black things inside the circle of non-ravens, because all non-black things are non-ravens. So I think those are different facts. Now, ordinary language isn't designed to deal with these kinds of stresses. I don't know that ordinary use of the word is going to settle this for us, but my inclination is to say that logical equivalence of this kind doesn't mean sameness of fact. Why? Well, you might believe one of these without believing the other one. It would be inconsistent of you. But the basic insight is the way that this represents how things are in the world is different from the way that this represents how things are in the world, though the one will be satisfied if only if the other one is satisfied. However, I don't feel very dogmatic about this, and maybe you can correct me on this. I mean, I think you ought to think about that. Let's suppose I'm right. I'm pretty confident I'm right about this, that the statement that all ravens are black will be true if and only if all non-black things are non-ravens. If it's not a black thing, it's not a raven. But are those exactly the same fact? I don't think so. Frege thought that you could, and his followers like Davidson thought, you could refute the correspondence theory by taking these equivalences like this. And there's a trick argument called a slingshot argument that rests on the mistaken assumption that you get these equivalences. So snow is white is true if and only if snow is white and Diogenes is identical with Diogenes. Are those the same fact? Well, I don't think so. The first one, snow is white, has got nothing to do with Diogenes. If you think that this expression, the fact that, is extensional with respect to substitutability of logical equivalences or co-referring expressions, then I think you do get paradoxes. But why should it be? The fact that inherits the representational character of the proposition that, precisely because it is designed to give a perfect match. Wherever you have a true statement, you have a fact, not because there's some deep metaphysical reason, but simply the word fact has evolved to specify that which corresponds to a true statement. Okay, I now want to show you that the idea that there's a deep dispute between disquotation and the correspondence theory is a mistake, that you can get one from the other quite easily by making very natural assumptions. But again, that was a good question. Any other questions at this point? Because this is, a lot of people will tell you that these issues are really the central issues in the philosophy of language. Okay. Start with S is true if and only if P. And you need a word for the condition specified by the P over here. And I have suggested that the word fact has evolved for that purpose. So S is true if and only if blank, 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 the facts. What do we put in the blank? The word fact has evolved so that we have a general term that will name satisfied truth conditions. But you then need a statement. A statement is true if and only if the facts. You need a word to fill the blank. And there's a bunch of words that evolved for that purpose. You can say a statement is true if and only if it corresponds to the fact, or it states the fact, or it fits the facts, or it matches the facts, or it describes the facts. All of those seem to me words that have evolved. And the one that is sort of stuck is corresponds to the fact. So a statement is true if and only if it corresponds to the facts, have evolved as ways of generalizing disquotation. Now that's a deep point, so let me repeat it. Disquotation says any statement S is true if and only if P, where for the statement where for the S you substitute the specification of a statement, and for P you repeat the statement. Fine, but you need a word for those satisfied truth conditions, and I say the word fact has evolved to fit that need. But then in order to be able to say this, you need a verb. You got to have a verb now. What's the relationship between the statements and the facts? If a statement is true if and only if the facts. You need something to fill in the blank, and the word that has evolved for that corresponds to a good one, actually. It states. A statement states the facts, or fits the facts, or matches the facts, or describes. And the one that has stuck in philosophy is corresponds to. So you can say any statement is true if and only if it corresponds to the facts. That is not inconsistent with this quotation. It's a generalization. Give me two assumptions, and I will get the correspondence theory from this quotation. The first assumption is that you need a word to fit what is generally the case on the right-hand side if the statement is true. You need a word to describe those satisfied truth conditions, and the word fact has evolved to fit that need. But then if that's right, you need a verb. A statement is true if and only if blank the facts, and the words that have evolved for that are corresponds, states, fits, matches, or describes. Corresponds seems to be the favorite. But then a statement is true if and only if it corresponds to the fact. That just is the correspondence theory. Now, taken properly as a trivial statement about the relationship between statements and truth conditions, that's trivially true. It must be right. But in philosophy, we always have an urge to misunderstand it. We think, well, on the left-hand side statement, there must be a representation, and the right-hand side, there must be a thing, an object, or a pile of objects, or a concatenation of objects, and that's the mistake. It's not an object, it's a condition. And what are conditions? Conditions are as various as the types of propositions for which they are the conditions. Give me the proposition, and I'll tell you what the condition is, because it's trivial. If the proposition is counterfactual, if I had dropped this piece of chalk, it would have fallen to the floor. Then the condition is counterfactual. If I had dropped this piece of chalk, it would have fallen to the floor, because the true statement is true, by the way. That corresponds to the fact. It corresponds to the fact that if I had dropped this piece of chalk, it would have fallen to the floor. However, I don't want to suggest that solves all of our problems, because we're still left with these puzzles about logically equivalent statements. And I think the statement that all ravens are black is indeed true, because it corresponds to the fact that all ravens are black, and it's true if and only if all non-black things are non-ravens, but all the same, that's not the same fact, because the condition is differently specified. Okay, so that's my theory of truth, and in a way, it kind of it doesn't make truth seem very exciting. It's just we need a word for evaluating success in certain types of speech acts, certain types of intentional states like beliefs. We need a word for the satisfied direction of fit, and the word true has evolved for that. So disquotation is trying to say something true, namely that you do get a perfect match, but it ends up saying something false, namely there's nothing more than to a theory of truth than the statement of the match. No, there is something more. The something more is you need a distinction between the representations of reality and the reality that is represented. And the word truth has evolved as a word for marking success, just as false marks failure. in getting a match between the representation and the reality represented. Okay, so let's take questions about that. That is a theory of truth. Yeah, you had your hand up. Yeah. Yes. That's right. We have the picture is I like the way the picture corresponds to the guy. Here's the guy, and here's the picture. Here's Winston Churchill, and here's the picture of Winston Churchill. And is it a good picture? Well, does it look like Winston Churchill? That's the model we have. And Wittgenstein was right about this. Often in philosophy, our worst worries come from bad models. We have a model of how language has to relate to reality. Where you've got a noun, you must have a thing. And if you've got a noun fact, there must be a thing. It can be a complex thing. So that like the cat is on the mat, but that gives us the wrong picture because, the picture, if we were to draw it, is first there's a statement, the cat is on the mat, and then there is the fact itself. And what is the fact itself? Well, we can actually draw a picture of the fact. It's a rather unfortunate cat suffering as it does from, it suffers from what's called a cerebellar magnificence. It's got a head that's too big, okay. But that's all right. We love the cat all the same. So that's the cat is on the mat, but how about the cat is not on the mat? How do I draw that? Poor, lonely, empty mat, or cat wandering off here? You see, what's the picture of the cat is not on the mat? And the answer is, why should there be a picture? It's an oddball case that you can actually draw the picture, but the fact that we can draw a picture leads us to think, well, that's what facts look like. They're complex things. The damn cat is nailed to the mat, so to speak, and that's the complex fact that the cat is on the mat. No, that's wrong. Any condition will do. And what's the condition that the cat is not on the mat? That's it. The cat is not on the mat. Yes, but where might the cat be? Well, that's another question. We'll get to that later. However, now what is the urge that leads us to think this? And I think the urge is, I can go another step. There are two sources of the urge. One is, every noun has to name a thing. So if the word fact is an honest to John legitimate noun, there must be a thing, the fact. And the second urge is the one Leibniz taught us, and that is, reality is that which is totally determinate. All the details are filled in the real world. If you believe that Sally has brown hair, well, there are different shades of brown, different amounts of hair. But the actual Sally herself, that is totally fixed. All the details are fixed. The shade, the number of hairs, all of that is absolutely fixed. And reality is in that way totally fixed. But the facts, if it's a fact that the cat is not on the mat, well, that doesn't seem to be fixed because there are all sorts of ways that the cat could not be on the mat. But then, of course, in that sense, this isn't fixed either. The cat might have been an inch to the right or an inch to the left. There are all sorts of variations on this. So we have the illusion that facts ought to be like objects and they ought to become, all the details ought to be fixed, but they're not. A fact, to repeat, is not an object, it's a condition. It is a satisfied condition. Now remember, the notion of truth condition is systematically ambiguous between the requirement and the thing required. So if I say it's raining, then the requirement of my statement is that it should be raining. But the fact in the world that it is raining, that is the thing required. So condition is systematically ambiguous. There are a lot of words in English like that. Criterion is the same way. It's ambiguous between the requirement and the thing required by the requirement. Okay, so I've now given you what, with some hesitation, I would call a theory of truth. It's a version of the correspondence theory, and it says really what the correspondence theory is trying to say is true. If a statement is true, then in general there's something in virtue of which, or something that makes it true. A word has evolved for those somethings. They're called facts, but other words are states of affairs. I guess states of affairs make things true as much as facts do. And that's, if you state all that, it ought to sound trivial, and if it's true, it is trivial. But we have in philosophy a deep urge to misunderstand it. We think facts ought to be like complex objects or complex things, and then we can't seem to find a complex thing for counterfactual statements. If it had been the case that P, it would have been the case that Q. Or for negative statements, it's not the case that P. And the answer is, of course we can. The fact that there are no elephants in this, the statement that there are no elephants in this room corresponds to the fact that there are no elephants in this room. Our dissatisfaction comes from we feel, well, that's not determinate enough. What we want is, you've got to be able to draw a picture of an elephant-free room. That's the honest to John fact that makes it the case that there are no elephants in this room. And in a way, that's right, but if you draw that picture right, it's just a picture of the fact that there are no elephants in this room. Okay, now I'm going to turn to the dreaded topic of relativism. But let's take another question. Yeah. Yeah, okay. I should talked about that, so let me say a little bit more about that. A historical point. Tarski gave us a definition of truth that really impressed a lot of people and had a sort of dazzling effect. I am suspicious, for reasons that I've tried to put across to you, and in general, I think that the technical solutions to philosophical problems that were very influential in the 20th century, in general, don't work. Maybe Russell's theory of descriptions is an exception, but possible world analyses of counterfactual seem to me hopelessly inadequate. And the Tarski set theoretical analysis of truth, I want to say, adds nothing to our understanding of truth of the sort that I'm trying to add. But repeat the question. I got so carried away. Oh yeah, relationship between meaning and truth. Because of the dazzling effect of the Tarskian model, some people thought maybe we can analyze meaning in terms of truth. And Davidson tried to do that. Davidson said that Davidson turned Tarski upside down. Now, because Tarski says, give me the notion of meaning and I will analyze the notion of truth. Give me the notion that in S is true if and only if P, what we substitute for P means the same thing as S. That is, snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. And if we were doing this with English as a meta language and French as the object language, we can say la neige est blanche is true in French if and only if snow is white, because you get the same meaning. Or Schnee ist weiß, you can do it with any language you like. Meaning, Tarski is saying, give me meaning and I'll define truth. Now what Davidson did was turn that upside down. Let's assume that Tarski is right about truth. Then we can define meaning in terms of truth. To know the meaning of a sentence is to know under what conditions it's true, and to know what a speaker means by a sentence is to know under what conditions he would hold that sentence to be true, under what conditions he would believe it. So they saw a tight connection between meaning and truth. It didn't work for complex reasons, but the basic reason it didn't work is they wanted these notions to be completely extensional. So it's true that snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. But as far as just truth conditions are concerned, then snow is white is true if and only if grass is green, because they are both true. And if you think of truth conditions as not specifying how things are represented, but just are they true or false, then you got a problem. If you're Davidson, how do you block that? An enormous amount of intellectual effort was spent trying to show how to block that. And I don't want to, it's not worth going into, but they failed. The efforts to define meaning in terms of truth, where you try to construe the whole analysis extensionally. So wherever you got the same truth conditions, you can substitute unless you give reasons, unless you give some other constraints that prevent the substitution. That doesn't work. All of these notions are intentional with an S, Meaning is intentional with an S. Fact is intentional with an S. And believes to be true, which is what Davidson wants to analyze, that's intentional with an S as well. You don't get substitutability. And you can look at the literature on this if you're interested. It's huge. There's a huge amount of literature on this. Maybe the best summary is in a little book by Scott Soames called, I think it's just called The Philosophy of Language. And Soames gives a summary of how the Davidsonian project failed. And I think it's generally agreed that it did fail. But there's an intuition that's right. And the intuition is this. To know the meaning of a declarative sentence in general is to know under what conditions it's true. And that's correct. Why? Well, because what the statement does is, what the sentence does, if used to make a statement, is represent its truth conditions. So if you know the meaning of the sentence, snow is white, you'll know that it's true if and only if snow is white. So there's a connection between meaning and truth. But that's not what these guys wanted. That's loaded with terms that are not extensional. They don't admit of substitutability. They want something that sounds more scientific. There was a completely extensional notion, and they failed. They failed to get that. I see no reason why they should have wanted that. I think that's a mistake of the last half of the 20th century, is that a science of meaning has to be stated in completely extensional terms. Why should it? I mean, economics isn't statable in extensional terms. You have to understand people's desires in order to understand the demand curve and the supply curve in economics. And desires always represent things under certain aspects and not under other aspects. So the obsession with extensionality, I think, was a mistake. But it's a deep question you're asking. Let me give it a quick summary. There is a connection between meaning and truth. For sentences used to make assertions, to know the meaning is to know the truth conditions. You have to know other stuff like that it is used to make an assertion. It doesn't work for orders and commands and promises, but that's the basic insight, and that's right. If you know the meaning of the word red, you know under what conditions it's true to say of something that it's red. But there is a version of that which didn't work, and that is the effort to use a Tarski-style truth definition to give a completely extensional analysis of meaning, and that failed for complex reasons of the sort I just hinted at. Okay, any other questions of this stuff? And now, a lot of people tell you this is the heart of the philosophy of language. I don't think it is. I do not think reference and truth are the heart of the subject, but I'm very definitely a minority person in this. The mainstream of the subject treats reference and truth, beginning with Frege and going right through to Kripke and Putnam and the externalists. They think that's what the philosophy of language is. I don't think it is. I think the most important parts of the philosophy of language are the intentionalistic parts. There's intentionality with a T, and that's because speaking a language is performing speech acts, and it's a form of intentional human behavior. And it's true, you want to be able to account for reference and truth, but you will not get a deep understanding of reference and truth except in terms of a general picture of how they relate to the human mind and human behavior. That's a minority opinion. Most of these guys go with the views that I've been discussing. Okay, other questions. I'm now going to spend the next few minutes attacking relativism about truth. And there is something I wrote about this that I never published, and it's on my website, and it's called The Refutation of Relativism, and I'll actually assign it. In fact, somebody ought to go through and clean it up because it's in Unix formatting. None of you are old enough to remember Unix formatting, but it was a great program invented in this university by a graduate student in the computer science department, and now we have much more powerful computers. So that you don't have to use all those formatting commands. But I'll clean it up and put it on the website in this dreadful program that I use. It's called Word. But in any case, we're stuck with it. But if you can handle Unix formatting, just download it. It's on my website, and I told you how to get to the website. It's called The Refutation of Relativism. Okay, what is relativism? Relativism it takes many different forms. There's relativism about truth, relativism about ethics, relativism about aesthetics, and those are not all equivalent, but the one that's most interesting and the one I'm going to be concerned with is relativism about truth. And what exactly is relativism about truth? Initially, it is the view that all truth is relative. That becomes important when you specify, well, what's it relative to? And there the answer is, it's relative to people who make the truth claim, people who make the assertions. It's relative to their preferences and attitudes. And why is that important? Well, because it turns out that what is true for me might not be true for you. So there could be inconsistent truths, both of which are equally true. I believe and assert that P, you believe and assert that not P, and we're both right because truth is always relative. It's relative to the people making the assertion. Now, what explains the appeal of relativism? I have been teaching in this university for over 50 years, and I find there's a kind of permanent appeal, especially to beginning philosophers, to relativism. Somehow, well, it's all really relative, relative to me and to you and other people. And I think the appeal of relativism is double. On the one hand, it satisfies a kind of democratic urge. Everybody has an equal right to their opinions. And it's true that people's opinions differ, but they can all be right. Everybody can be right because truth will be relative to their preferences and attitudes. So there's a sort of democratic urge. But also there's a kind of egotistical urge that says, my opinions are as good as anybody's, and in fact what's true is what's true for me. So there are really two conflicting intuitions, one of massive egotism, my opinions are what counts, and another not really consistent urge to say, well, everybody's entitled to their opinion, and nobody's opinion is any better than anybody else's. So I think that is the long-term appeal of relativism. Now, in philosophy, there's a standard refutation of relativism. And it's odd that professional philosophers in general don't tend to take it very seriously, but I think they ought to, at least if they're interested in their students' mental health, because many of their students are tempted to it. And the refutation goes as follows. The problem with relativism is you can't even state it without inconsistency. As Quine says, you can't state relativism without rising above it. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, if you state it, and there are different ways of stating it, you could say, as I have been saying, all truth is relative, is relative to the makers or holders, let's say, to persons, to the persons making the thing. Or you can say, another one is, there are no absolute truths, no truths that are not relative. Those would be two ways of making the same point. And there are other ways of making the same point that you sometimes hear. Another was about validity. There are no universally valid truths. Okay, now the standard objection goes as follows. Yeah, well, what about these propositions? Are they relative? How about the proposition that all truth is relative? Is that itself relative, or is it absolute? Well, either way, you got a problem. If you say, no, it's an absolute truth that all truth is relative, you've just refuted yourself, because you've said all truth is relative, except there's one very important exception, namely the truth that all truth is relative is itself not relative, it's absolute. But then you've given up on relativism if you say it's an absolute truth. Because if you've allowed for a major, important exception, why shouldn't there be lots of other exceptions? But if you say, no, all truth is relative, including the truth that all truth is relative, then you're saying, well, okay, it's relative to my preferences, but then if I don't prefer to believe that all truth is relative, then it's no longer valid for me. Does everybody see this objection that you can't state relativism without denying relativism? Because if you, the whole point of relativism is to establish a universal claim about all truth claims, namely that they're true only relative to the preferences, attitudes of the person making the claim. But if that truth is itself intended to be a general truth, then it's got to be non-relative and not itself a relative truth. So you've contradicted yourself. If, on the other hand, you say, no, that's relative too, everything's relative, including the truth that all truth is relative, then it's up to anybody whether or not they want to accept it. Okay, it's true for you that all truth is relative, but not true for me, therefore, for me at least, it's not true that all truth is relative. Either way, you're in trouble. Now, I think most relativists are not impressed by this. They feel that there's a kind of logical trick involved here. It's a kind of trick that analytic philosophers play on honest people when they do these language tricks. They trick them into this little corner. And I think that there was a period when relativism was actually fashionable among people who should know better. People who actually taught in universities. They were called postmodernists. I don't know what happened to them. Did they disappear? Or maybe they just got tenure and shut up or don't talk to philosophers anymore. But anyway, they were called postmodernists. And I think they thought they were possessed of a deep insight. And it's not refuted by this sort of logic chopping. And a deep insight is this. Everything that we say is from a point of view. Everything we say is always relative to, and then it turns out, our historical situation, the culture we're brought up in, or among their favorites, our race, ethnicity, gender, and class. It's all relative to that, and there is no absolute or neutral point of view from which you can survey the relations between points of view and reality to see if some are better than others. So what underlies relativism is the deep conviction all utterances and hence all truth can only exist relative to a point of view. And that, in one way you have to say, well, there's something right about the claim that all utterances are from a point of view, because, of course, as I've argued over and over, all intentionality exists only relative to an agent who has the intentional state. All speech acts are performed only by the people actually performing the speech acts. So if it is right that representation is always made relative to the situation of the person making the representation, why doesn't relativism follow? Stay tuned on Thursday. I'll answer that.